Guys, we are in our final section of this Unit 6, this Imperialism unit. And we're going to focus on Japan. And this is one of my favorite topics when we get into imperialism, because this one, if any, really launches us into the idea of what World War I and World War II end up becoming. Japan's very late to the game when it comes to industrializing, but they learned from everybody else that was slower and fixed things and did things a little bit better. So let's get started. In 1853, the United States warships arrived off the coast of Japan, demanding Japan open its ports to trade. Japanese leaders debated how to respond. Some resisted giving up their long-standing policy of seclusion. Others felt it was a wiser course to learn from the foreigners. And so this starts with understanding kind of how the government and how things in Japan were before. And so by 1603, the Tokugawa Ieyasu had gained the office of what was called shogun, the top military commander in Japan. This ended a long period of lawlessness and chaos in Japan. Although the emperor still lived in the capital of Kyoto, the shogun held real power in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. Tokugawa shoguns reimposed centralized feudalism in Japan, and really just kind of consolidated power. They, for a short time, allowed the Dutch to have very limited trade. And for almost 250 years, Japan developed in isolation. During that time, the economy expanded, especially internal commerce. Farm output grew, and the bustling cities began to spring up. But then you started having some hardships grow by being so cut off. Economic growth brought changes, but put strains on the country. The daimyo suffered financial hardship because their wealth was in land. In a commercial economy, money was needed. The daimyo, which was the upper class, had the heavy expense of maintaining households in both Edo and in their own domains. So then you had the lesser samurai, who were kind of the warrior class, were also unhappy because they were no longer fighters. Many were simply government bureaucrats. They were not warriors anymore. And even though they were noble, they lacked the money to live, as well as urban merchants. And so merchants, in turn, had resented their own place at the bottom of the social ladder. No matter how rich they were, they had no political power. Peasants, meanwhile, suffered under heavy taxes. So there was a lot of discontent from really at every level of society. And this is a great picture showing you the samurai. Now, so Japan eventually opens. While the shogun faced troubles at home, disturbing news reached him abroad. With alarm, he heard how the British had defeated China in the Opium War and how imperialists had forced China to sign unequal treaties. Japanese officials realized it would not be long before Western powers sought trading rights with Japan. And so you had some external pressure. In July 1853, a fleet of well-armed American ships, they were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Tokyo Bay. Perry carried a letter from the President of the United States. It demanded that Japan open its ports for trade. The shogun's advisors debated. They weren't really sure what to do, but eventually they decided they should let him in. So in the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, the shogun Asada agreed to open 3 Japanese ports for American ships, where they could take on supplies. The United States soon won trading rights in other rights, including a term called extraterritoriality. Britain, France, and Russia demanded and won similar rights. Like the Chinese, the Japanese were deeply resenting the humiliating terms of the treaty. Some bitterly criticized the shogun for not creating a strong stand against the foreigners. And so you kind of had this pressure. And so in 1867, right after the Civil War, the discontented daimyo and samurai led a revolt and unseated the shogun and restored the emperor, whose name was Mutoshido, to power. He moved from Kyoto, the old imperial capital, to the shogun's palace in Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, or Eastern Capital. Then you have the Meiji Restoration. Okay, so then the young emperor, just 15 years old, began a long reign known as the Meiji Restoration. This period, which lasted from 1868 to 1912, was a major turning point in Japanese history. The Meiji reformers who ruled in the emperor's name were determined to strengthen Japan against the West. Their goal was to summarize their motto, a rich country, a strong military. The new leaders set out to study Western ways, adapt them to the Japanese needs, eventually protect Japan from having to give in to Western demands. In 1871, members of the government traveled abroad to learn about Western governments, economies, technologies, and traditions. So this really is starting that push of Japan becoming a major power, but it would take a little bit. Not long, but it'd take a little bit. Meiji reformers had an enormous task. They were committed to replacing the rigid feudal order with a completely new political and social system and to build modern industrial economy. Change did not come easily. However, Japan adapted foreign ideas with great success and speed. And so they had to first reform the government. You had a legislature that was formed, or a diet. It was made up of one elected house and one house appointed by the emperor. Suffrage, or the right to vote, was also limited, but you did see them kind of reforming government. It wasn't just one person, it was several people in charge to exchange idea. But then you had rapid industrialization. Meiji rulers made the economy a major priority. They encouraged Japan's business class to adopt Western methods. The government set up a modern banking system, built railroads, improved ports, organized telegraph and postal systems. Really, to get industry started, the government typically built factories and then sold them to wealthy business families who developed them further. With such support, business dynasties like the Mitsubishi and the Kawasaki, names you should know, families soon ruled industrial emperors and really rivaled families like the Rockefellers in the United States. These powerful banking and industrial families became known as Zaibatsu, which is that term you see right there. You had some social changes and things like an ended legal distinction between classes, thus freeing more people to build the nation. They set up schools, universities, really just anything modern culturally that you could think of, they focused on. While the government agreed to some increases in education for women, it dealt harshly with other attempts for change. It took away early political and legal rights that women had won. In 1898, Japanese women were forbidden from any political participation and were legally lumped together with minors. So women were not doing so well in this new Japanese society. Then you had an amazing success. They modernized at a speed that we had not seen previously. It was a homogeneous society. That is, people shared common cultural language, but they grew and were able to kind of put away some of those things and really not be an imperialist, true imperial country that we've seen where somebody just comes in and takes over. They carved out their own success and ended up becoming a powerhouse on the planet. All right, so Japan ends up building an empire. As in Western industrial nations, Japan's economic needs fed its imperialist desires. As a small island nation, Japan lacked many basic resources, including coal. That was essential for industrial growth. Spurred by nationalism and a strong ambition to equal the West, Japan sought to build an empire. With its modern army and navy, it maneuvered for power in East Asia, and they do this a couple of ways. In 1894, competition between Japan and China for power in Korea led to what became known as the First Sino-Japanese War. Sino means Chinese. Although China had far greater resources, Japan had benefited from modernization. To the surprise of the Chinese, or to the surprise of China in the West, Japan had actually won pretty easily. It used the victory to gain treaty ports in China and control over the island of Taiwan. The war showed Japan had joined the Western powers in the race for empire. 10 years later, Japan successfully challenged Russia, its other rival power in Korea and Manchuria. During the Russo-Japanese War, Japan's army defeated Russian troops in Manchuria, and its navies destroyed almost an entire Russian fleet. For the first time in modern history, Asian power had humbled a European nation. In 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth, Japan gained control of Korea as well as the rights and ports of Manchuria. This foothold on the mainland would fuel its ambitions in East Asia. So you're starting to see Japan grow quickly, and this is going to lead us all the way through to World War II. Now, in Korea, though, imperialist rivalries put a spotlight on Korea. Located at the crossroads of East Asia and the Korean Peninsula, was a focus of competition among Russia, China, and Japan. Korea had been a tributary state of China for many years. A tributary state is independent but acknowledges the supremacy of a stronger state. Although influenced by China, Korea had its own traditions and government. They had their own language, all of these things. It's actually a beautiful culture. By the 1800s, Korea faced growing pressure from outsiders. As Chinese power declined, Russia expanded into the east. Then, as Japan industrialized, it too-eyed Korea. Once again, Korea saw itself as really a shrimp among these whales. They had not modernized the same way. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea outright, absorbing the kingdom into its Japanese empire. Now, Japanese rule in Korea wasn't good for Koreans. Japan ruled Korea for 35 years. Like Western imperialists, Japanese set out to modernize their newly acquired territory. They built factories, railroads, communication systems, kind of the same thing as other places. Development, however, generally benefited the colonial power. Under Japanese rule, Koreans produced more rice than ever before, but most of it went to feed the Japanese. The Japanese were as unpopular in Korea as Western imperialists were elsewhere. They imposed harsh rule over their colony and deliberately set out to erase Korean language and identity. Repression bred resentment, and resentment in return nourished a Korean nationalist movement. 9 years after annexation, a nonviolent protest against Japanese began on March 1st, 1919, and soon spread throughout Korea. The Japanese crushed the uprising and massacred many Koreans. The violence did not discourage people who worked to end Japanese rule. Instead, the March 1st movement became a rallying symbol for Korean nationalists. The Koreans would have to wait many years to regain their freedom. By the early 1900s, Japan was the strongest power in Asia in competition with Western nations. Japan continued to expand in East Asia. In time, Japanese ambitions to control the sphere of influence in the Pacific would be put on a collision course with several Western powers, especially Britain and the United States. If you have any questions about this moment in history, let me know.